Welcome back, everyone, to this third part of our James Bond series. Today we're going to be talking about behind the scenes of Bond, all the little known facts you may not have known, all the things you already do. So let's get started. Joe, what do you have for me first?
I'm just going to dive right in and let's talk about the agents themselves. There was a 002, a 003, a 004, a 009. They were all killed, by the way. 006, if we remember, was in GoldenEye. Also, 008's replacement was Bond's replacement had Bond ever been killed, but he never was. Neither 001 or 005 are ever mentioned, period.
Yes, I did remember seeing that tidbit, and I wonder if they ever went above 008, or if they ever will be in the future since this franchise is going to keep going. Another thing you may not know is that David Bowie was originally lined up to play the villainous Max Zorin in A View to Kill. Who knows how that would have played out? I mean, David Bowie did play some kind of out there characters, if you remember, in Labyrinth.
Yep.
He was a villain in that movie, but he just doesn't have that hard edge of the villains that Bond is known for.
True, and Christopher Walken, who did play that part, did a great job. Bowie has done a couple of interesting things. It would have been interesting to see that. If you pay close attention to From Russia with Love at the 1 hour 16 mark, there's the train that Bond is on, and a passenger, he passes an old man on the train. That old man is Ian Fleming in a rare cameo appearance.
This is actually still not confirmed. All over the website you see that some websites say it is, some websites say it's rumored to be. When the digital remastered version came out, there was another series of posts that came out about whether it was Ian Fleming or not. So it seems like this hasn't been completely confirmed.
Yeah, but it definitely doesn't go away either.
It doesn't. Everybody wants to know, did he come out in this movie or not? So hopefully at some point Eon Productions will let us know the truth.
Yeah. Granted, for those of you who did not know, Sean Connery wore a hairpiece in every movie that he was in.
I know. That was an amazing little fact. I did not know that he actually wore a hairpiece at that time. He was very young.
Yeah, and he looked good, too. You would have never picked it out. Although in the later movies, it was you could start to pick it out just a bit.
So let's move on to another little tidbit. In Dr. No's underwater lair, one vital element was very nearly forgotten in the production, which was the background footage of the fish swimming.
Right.
So they scrambled to get this footage to get it on the day of shooting. So like the day before, they found some footage of fish swimming. Little did they realize that it was a zoomed version of this footage. So they had to have Dr. No explain that the glass that they were looking at the fish was actually magnified.
Right. I do remember him saying that. That's why it looks bigger, which is pretty funny. So let's talk about Bond and kills. Obviously, a lot of people get shot in these movies. The count is up to 1,299 deaths in all movies combined, and Bond himself is responsible for killing 352 bad guys.
Yeah, Bond's numbers definitely add up, and after 24 movies, I'm surprised it's that low. With all these stunts and adventures that he's been on, you would think that there would have been quite a few more, but that is a pretty high number right there.
Yes, it is. If you remember back to Thunderball, when they blew up the yacht called the Flying Saucer, they were experimenting with some new rocket fuel to use as a special effect explosive. The crew didn't know how much to use, and they used way too much. That's why it blows up like it does. And they actually saw it 30 miles away in Nassau.
Wow, I did not know that tidbit. That's a good one. Another one, back to Dr. No, is the studio's Japanese affiliate originally titled this as We Don't Want Doctors.
I did not know that.
Would be a very funny title to see here in the U.S.
Interesting note about Roger Moore. He suffers from hyplophoma, if I'm saying that right, which is the fear of firearms.
Wow. That is not something you want in a Bond, since all they do is pick up firearms.
Yeah.
Well, Bond has been riddled with controversy over the years, whether it's been about the aspects of the film, the behind the scenes, or things like that. But one of the major controversies was that the Vatican, after the film's release, the first film's release, they issued a special communique expressing its disapproval at the film's moral standpoint. So this was back,
Back in the day.
back in the day. The Vatican was not happy about what it saw in Bond movies, and it definitely made its opinion felt.
Well, one interesting tidbit here about our favorite villain, Goldfinger. Gert Forbes, who was the actor that played Goldfinger, he was a German actor. When he was hired on, he could not speak English.
Oh, wow.
So his entire performance is dubbed by actor Michael Collins.
Wow, I did not know that.
No,
one.
it's convincing. I watched it, and you would never pick it out.
Well, another thing that was amazing to hear was of the directors that were chosen for this, Alfred Hitchcock was considered to direct one of the Bond movies, with Bond being played by Cary Grant and Grace Kelly lured out of retirement to play Tatiana Romanova. But it was scrapped after Vertigo's big flop in the theaters, so they decided to go with another director. But it would have been interesting to see what Hitchcock would have done with that. They did, though, kind of give him an homage with the helicopter sequence. So it was a throwback to North by Northwest.
Mm-hmm. If you remember the actor Christopher Lee, he was Ian Fleming's cousin.
Yes, he was.
And he was originally offered to play the part of Dr. No in the first Bond film. He passed on that, but he did get into it because in the Man with the Golden Gun, he played Scaramanga.
Another little tidbit is the moves in the chess game played by Kronstein are from the game played by Boris Spassky and David Bronstein at the USSR Championship in Leningrad in 1960. So that was kind of interesting.
Nice tie-in there. If you are a big fan of going online and looking at the website IMDb, which we go to all the time, it tells you anything and everything you ever want to know about a movie. James Bond character page is 007.
And then if you did not know this, though, Bond is always appearing with his classic Aston Martin.
Yeah.
The first car to ever appear in a 007 film was the Chevrolet Bel Air seen in 1962's Dr. No.
Yeah, that was the convertible with the bad guy driving.
Yes, it was.
It's interesting that Ian Fleming also wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Yes.
Of all movies, where I think we all agree that he's known for his Bond character, which starred Dick Van Dyke, which explains the connection that Dick Van Dyke tried out for the part, but they wouldn't take him on because his English accent wasn't up to par. So there was a nice tie-in.
Which is kind of funny because in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, he does try that English accent again.
Yes, he does. So Ian Fleming obviously wasn't about to give up on Dick Van Dyke, which in his own right is a great actor. He did some great stuff. Daniel Craig was the first actor to play Bond who's younger than the Bond series.
Yes. So Daniel Craig was younger than the series, but George Lazenby, was actually the youngest Bond of the bunch.
That's true. So the record for the most times that an actor was in all of the Bond movies, of course, is our good friend Desmond Llewellyn, who played Q in 17 of the movies, which is just an unbelievable fact. But on top of that, in Skyfall, M, who is played by Judi Dench, actually has more screen time in that performance alone than all of Desmond's performances added up in his 17 times.
Yeah, I think if you choose some actors that have been consistent through the series that have lasted, it would be Judi Dench and definitely Desmond Llewellyn. He's been in so many of the films. He's been a staple to the Bond franchise.
Yes, he has. The Walter PPK, which we all know is Bond's gun, is exactly the same model of gun that Adolf Hitler used to commit suicide.
Ooh, yeah. I remember reading that. I forgot about that one. So let's talk about the title sequences for a bit. These have become very iconic to the Bond franchise. And over the years, they've progressed and gotten better, and we've started to see more special effects used in them, of course. The songs, of course, have also become very sought after for artists to do the Bond theme, and only one artist has actually done 2 songs, which was Shirley Bassey, who did Goldfinger, and then came back and did the theme song for Diamonds Are Forever. Goldfinger, I think, is my favorite of the bunch. When it comes to the songs, Goldfinger definitely is the top one that anyone can relate to with Bond. You hear Goldfinger, you know it's Bond.
Got to say, Skyfall's opening may be one of the best that there is.
I do have to agree with you on that one. This latest title sequence was just extraordinary, and the song, which was performed by Adele, was just such a beautiful song. But one of my my favorites has always been the Goldfinger opening.
Yeah, also
The
excellent.
song and just the way that they projected the imagery, everything in that is so well done, so beautifully done. And if you think about it, this was done back in the 60s,
Yep.
where we didn't have After Effects, we didn't have Premiere. This was all cut by hand.
Yep.
They project a name onto her body, and it's not quite sharp or clear. They definitely made sure that all the stars and the directors and the producers were as sharp and as clear as possible. But there's a couple that slipped by. But this is a very hard process to do, especially when they're filming in the dark.
Yep.
There wasn't a lot of light, obviously, because they're projecting this image onto her body. So this was definitely a challenge for them to get done correctly, and I think they did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, I thought it turned out really well too. Projecting images back then wasn't very good, so they had that to struggle with. Yes, it's somebody's body, which obviously is not a flat surface, so you've got indentations and curves and things like that. And staying in focus would have been very, very, very challenging. So yeah, I agree with you. It probably took them a lot longer than we think to get this right.
So let's talk a little bit about the things that have developed over the years with the Bond franchise, speaking from a cinematic standpoint. Like, for example, in the beginning movies, we didn't have After Effects, we didn't have special effects, we didn't have green screening, we had rear projection. So we see so much rear projection in the beginning.
Yeah, because back then, if you wanted somebody in a car or in some exotic locale, and they use green screen now, and that turns out very good. But back then, rear projection was, and you could pick it out. There's no doubt about it. You see Bond driving the car, and behind him you see the background moving around, and he's trying to turn the wheel the right way. And I'm sure he had people in front of him going, "No, turn this way, bounce up and down a little bit." It's all they had back then.
If you look at the Hollywood franchise all throughout those eras, you see so many movies where they had people in cars, not just in the Bond franchise, but all throughout Hollywood, where the characters aren't even paying attention to the road. They're talking to each other, and they're just looking at each other, and you're thinking to yourself, you're going to hit a tree.
Yeah, exactly. But then you look at current movies, and not just Bond, but other movies that use car sequences. You can't imagine what goes on behind the scenes to capture a really good car sequence. Cars are on trolleys. There's an entire film crew in front of it towing this
Camera
thing.
rigs.
There's camera rigs that float alongside, both sides of the car. It is a big, big, big deal, and it still sometimes doesn't turn out great. Mm-hmm. So again, going back to those earlier films, it's all they had. They did the best they could. I'm okay with it.
I was okay with it too. And now in the 2000s and in this Daniel Craig era, we see so much more. In the last 15 to 20 years, the technology that has come through Hollywood has made it possible for us to see movies with such cinematic power as Skyfall.
Agreed. The editing has definitely gotten tighter. It's very, very apparent in the Daniel Craig series. That's what gives it that edgy type of feel to it. It's not sloppy feeling.
Right.
It's right on the numbers. I think one of the other things that has improved over the years, that's blowing things up. In the early days, they used, gasoline or rocket fuel, and, they actually just blew things up and hoped it went well. Obviously, with today's CGI and editing techniques and running 18 cameras at a time, they can come up with some just fantastic explosions. So if you look at the early movies of things getting blown up, like when they blew up the island for Dr. No and that processing plant, and then look at something that's been done recent, there's no comparison.
There isn't. I mean, most of the stuff that's done these days is already... It's stock footage that's manipulated to look as the explosions on hand. We do have fires. We do have real explosions in some of them. The technology that has been developing over the last decade or so has definitely allowed editors and the special effects crew to just incorporate so many different things that we weren't able to see before. In the early 90s, we did see a lot more cameras being used because they were being developed faster, better cameras. There was that scene in, I believe, Tomorrow Never Dies, where he is on that motorcycle and he jumps over the helicopter.
Yes.
And I believe they used 14 cameras for to shoot that, to capture that. And being able to have 14 different cameras, 14 different angles will allow the editors to really precisely cut and give you the best cinematic feel.
Yeah, that is a big advantage these days. They certainly didn't run that kind of a camera count in the early days. They were lucky if they had 2 or 3 cameras. Because you got to remember, folks, back in the day, in the very first movies, their budgets were not like they are today.
No, they were not.
If memory serves, I believe Sean Connery received $34,000 to make the first Bond movie. That was all he got.
Yeah, Hollywood budgets were definitely not what they are today. Today, having $100 million for a movie is almost standard.
Yeah, it's fairly commonplace. I think one of the other special effects that has drastically changed is the use of miniatures. Back in the early days of Bond, and certainly a lot of movies, they used miniatures for cars, weapons, sets, scaled down, done in the studio. And if you've never worked with miniatures, folks, it is incredibly difficult to get the physics right of things moving, smoke flowing, wind blowing. Scale size just kills you. So it's kind of a lost art these days when CGI came around.
Yeah, definitely 3D modeling has changed the cinematic world. These days, if you want to recreate a whole new city, like, for example, in the latest remake of Total Recall, a lot of that was CG. That was background 3D modeling that was composited with actual sets that they built. One of the last franchises that used models a lot was the Lord of the Rings one. They definitely used a lot of models throughout their filming, but nowadays it's more standard to see 3D composites being added to the video. I think another thing that definitely helped this franchise get off the ground was the development of the Steadicam rigs.
Yes.
If you remember in the early films, we definitely had more tripod-based shooting.
Yes.
There wasn't a lot of handheld. There was dollying, of course. We had camera cranes, but they weren't extensively used in the earlier films.
No, they
but
weren't.
then when Steadicam came about, we got to have those follow shots where we have the ability to follow Bond into the danger that he was always in. And nowadays it's standard, and you see the difference from, if you look at the first Dr. No and then you compare it to Skyfall, you see the difference in how they shot it.
Right. The style is totally different. In the early movies, you would see, again, from a tripod shot, the camera would follow as the action went past, that type of thing. And now there's somebody with the Steadicam running alongside or running in front, and they're within feet of the action and what is being filmed. And it adds a whole new dimension to the action.
It brings you right into the action because you're there sweating and panting with Bond yourself, because you're in his face. You see his close-ups of his hands, what he's doing, what he's manipulating. All of that has definitely brought Bond closer to all of us as we see him progress through the years.
Yeah, much more up close and personal than the earlier movies.
Definitely.
So it just wouldn't be a complete show, folks, if we did not talk about the overall success of the Bond franchise. And we're talking about dollars here. Never forget that movie making is a business.
It is.
And if you don't make a profit, it goes away. And that certainly is not the case with the James Bond franchise. So let's just hit some of these numbers about just how successful the entire series has been. Now, I know what you're thinking out there. You're saying, well, wait a second. There's, the Harry Potter franchise. There's Batman, of course. And, of course, let's not forget about Star Wars. Hugely, hugely successful. But it doesn't even come close. Adjusted for inflation, the Bond franchise has brought in excess of $12 billion, which is just an incredible dollar amount.
Yeah.
The number one grossing movie in the franchise was Thunderball.
Yes, it was Thunderball, which was a great film. And it brought movie fans definitely into the theaters, as we can tell. I mean, these days, films are not grossing as much as they usually did, like back in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, true.
But the Bond franchise keeps bringing fans back to the theater. Every single time there's a new Bond film, they're all out there seeing that movie. And as you all know, folks, movie prices are not cheap these days.
You're absolutely right. And I think Skyfall is an excellent example of how people are flocking to the movies, because Skyfall was the highest opening weekend of any James Bond film. In the opening weekend, it took in almost $88 million, which is absolutely huge, and at today's ticket prices. So from a dollar and cents business standpoint, the franchise is in great shape, and no doubt it will continue.
Well, I know I definitely will be one of the ones getting my tickets early for the next Bond film. So we'll see what the opening weekend brings in for that, because the last one, Skyfall, did make such a huge impact last year. And I'm guessing next year is going to be the same story.
So that's about it for this episode of Popcorn Diaries. Be sure to stay tuned for our fourth and final Bond Popcorn Diaries, which will be out in the next week or so. We have a very special guest, Raymond Benson. He has written over 30 novels, and 6 of those are Bond novels. He knows anything and everything about James Bond, and we certainly are going to pick his brain, so please don't miss episode number 4. So this is Joe.
And I'm Adriana, and thank you for joining us on Popcorn Diaries.